All right, y'all, welcome back to the show here. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton, and our next guest is Marcy Wheeler. She keeps the great blog Empty Wheel at emptywheel.net. And, of course, the big deal yesterday, which I guess I didn't realize till after the show, was that the New York Times had published this gigantic article all about the death council in the White House, where Barack Obama personally oversees the thumbs up, thumbs down decision on whether to use a robot to kill somebody somewhere in the world, which is very instructive. Now here, Marcy is pointing me toward this piece I didn't even know about, that I had missed entirely, that was here at the Daily Beast on the same subject. And, of course, whenever we're talking about the drone war, that means we're also talking about expansive policy, using them in more and more places around the world, spreading, of course, deeper into Africa, that kind of thing. Welcome back to the show, Marcy. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing great. I appreciate you joining us on the show today. When I read the New York Times piece, well, you know, Chris Floyd had a great critique of the morality of the Times and who these people are who write this stuff. But then I thought, you know, as far as the facts and what's the meat of this and in what order, there's really nobody that I would rather have take us through this article and what's important about it, the wheat and the chaff, because it is, 10,000 words or something, than you. So you sat down, I assume, and read the New York Times article yesterday, and I wonder, what was your takeaway? What did you think was the most important part of the story? Was it the where they describe everyone sitting down and doing the thumbs up, thumbs down process there?
Sort of, although I should correct you that the New York Times piece was 600 words, the Daily Beast piece was 4,000 words, so between them 10,000 words.
Oh.
What they do is they describe the death panel, both of them. But I argue today that they both describe an outdated version of the death panel. So what's important in the New York Times article is, I think the most important thing is a detail about the way that the Obama administration has been counting deaths in drone strikes, which is to say they're arguing that any military age male in the vicinity of somebody that they consider a target is also a legitimate target. So they're not counting. So, you know, there was a drone strike in Pakistan the other day that hit a bakery, none of mass destruction, I guess, and killed 3 people in the bakery. I don't know whether the baker was one of those people, but they're arguing, for example, that because the baker was there selling naan to people who may or may not have been Taliban or Al-Qaeda or what have you, then the baker himself is a legitimate target, and when they count up their numbers of civilians killed, they're not going to count the baker as a civilian because he's 30.
Mm-hmm. So that's the analogy that they use in the piece, right, in the Times piece was, hey, what are you doing in the back of a pickup truck with a bunch of bad guys if you're not one of the bad guys? That's basically the same thing you're talking about.
Yeah, And actually, what's really interesting is because one of the guys, there were 2 people killed in the Fad al-Quso strike, which was May 6th, so earlier this month. And one of the guys, basically what happened, Fad al-Quso was, visiting a friend who's a farmer, and the friend who's a farmer died. And now that friend's family is all pissed at us because he had nothing to do with AQAP. Sure, he knew Fad al-Quso, but he wasn't AQAP. And so, now we've made enemies of an entire other extended family in Yemen. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the New York Times piece makes it crystal clear that John Brennan is lying his pants off when he says there have been no civilian strikes, there have been no civilian deaths. Mind you, it uses John Brennan as a credible source in there, but it proves once and for all that John Brennan was lying when he said there was no civilian strikes. But it does show this gimmick that the Obama administration is using to try and pretend, probably not just for their own purposes, but for, so that they're not having to admit that they're breaking international law, so as to pretend that they're not killing civilians, which they in fact are.
Right, because anybody that they kill is a terrorist. And then they even have this great phrase, right, about posthumous, not acquittal, what they call it, where it could be that they find out later after you're dead that maybe you weren't really a bad guy, but they never do seem to do that.
Well, and the other thing is, as they're saying, we're just going to assume all military-age males are al-Qaeda members, they're also accusing journalists who risked their lives to go find out who died of sympathizing with the enemy. I mean, they're accusing the Bureau for Independent Journalism, for example. They've suggested that they're al-Qaeda sympathizers because they've risked their lives, gone into Waziristan and said, okay, tell me who died on such and such a date. And, that sort of ruins their whole little gimmick because then there's an independent source out there saying, al-Qaeda was wrong when they claimed, 10 civilians died, but also sometimes claiming, here are the names of the civilians, here's what they do, and here's what they were doing when the United States claimed they were meeting with al-Qaeda, but were in fact arguing over land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the Weekly Standard accounting for, what amounts to helping the enemy, only applied by the state. Same thing they're doing with Bradley Manning, right? They're saying anything that makes us look bad weakens our position in the world versus the terrorists, therefore you're on the side of the terrorists.
Right, exactly.
So that means that anybody who, publishing the Taguba report, was that Donald Rumsfeld that published the Taguba report? Does that mean that then he's a traitor? Because I read that thing and it was pretty brutal.
It is pretty brutal. But I mean, all of that, like the New York Times, really important point. The administration is using a gimmick to claim that they're not killing civilians. Take a step back and ask, why did these two pieces come out at once? Why did 10,000 words come out yesterday at once? And I went back today and looked at the AP piece, which came out about 10 days ago, which described John Brennan bringing all of the drone targeting into the White House in his own grubby little paws. Mm-hmm. And in there, there's actually a line where he says, even as he's bringing it all into the White House, even as he's bringing it, away from congressional scrutiny, away from FOIAing, he's at the same time saying, I should look up this line because it's priceless. He's basically saying, I thought it was important to show the American people that we're deliberating over these drone targets. He basically said, I'm going to run a PR firm. I'm going to start this PR take and rename signature strikes and tell everyone about how we used to vet drone strikes before we decided to use signature strikes in Yemen, so that everyone feels better about the fact that we're killing bakers and people who opened a gate and who were in the back of a Hilux in Yemen.
What's interesting is, I guess that they think it's good politics. Maybe it is good politics to have Barack Obama personally choosing on. It's funny, the way the New York Times put it, I forgot their exact phrasing, but it sort of seemed like they said he personally approves, I guess, all of them in Yemen and Somalia and most in Pakistan. Is that how you read it?
No, he personally approves a third of the strikes, but since the big number up until the last couple weeks in Yemen have been in Pakistan, that means, most of them. What the article says, and I would suggest there's contradictory reporting out there, so I'm not sure that we should totally believe the article. But what the article said, because remember that New York Times article, there were something like 12 current or former officials on the record. It was a sanctioned article.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So I would be very cautious about, it was great.
Yeah, as Chris Floyd said, it's all about making Barack Obama the wise philosopher king who takes personal responsibility because he read it in Thomas Aquinas and all this crap. He's got an election to win. We'll be right back after this with the Empty Wheel. Marcy Wheeler, emptywheel.net. All right, y'all, welcome back. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Marcy Wheeler. She's the Empty Wheel in the blog world. Emptywheel.net, that's her blog. And that's where she writes. And we're talking about secret kill list proves a test of Obama's principles and will in the New York Times. a love letter, a hymn to the violence, as Chris Floyd called it. And then this one is Drones, How Obama Learned to Kill, by Daniel Klaidman. This is an excerpt from his book, Kill or Capture, The War on Terror and the Soul of the Obama Presidency. I didn't know presidencies had souls, but anyway, that has been kind of the question, right, is that George Bush got in so much trouble for, kidnapping all these people and having them tortured hither and yon, and black sites here and Guantanamo Bay there, and Obama figured out it's a lot easier if you just kill them, and then you don't have to worry about browbeating them into a plea deal or anything else. And then, so he's carried that philosophy on and spread it throughout the world, huh?
Yeah, and that's another area where the New York Times article is very interesting, because it includes kind of subtle details and almost confirmation that that's what the administration does, although there's one guy, a Somalian, Ahmed Warsami, that we captured, and so I think Obama's going to point to that one guy for the rest of his administration and say, see, we actually didn't kill one person, so it's
right.
Proof we're trying to capture these guys.
Yeah. Well, they did cooperate with the Kenyans on some extraordinary rendition to Ethiopia back at the start of the American-backed Ethiopian invasion at Christmas 2006 and early 2007 there. I don't know if that counts. Oh, wait, that was Bush.
Ago,
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and so I think it's interesting because I think, what's going on and what these articles kind of write around, I think Klaidman is actually better on this front. The very last 4 paragraphs of the Klaidman article kind of make it clear that, for years, he's very good at showing how at first Obama's like, no, not going to do signature strikes in Pakistan. Oh, well, okay, I'll make this exception for Pakistan. And then, as Klaidman tells it, sometime last year, John Brennan was like, no way, we're not going to get involved in a campaign in Yemen. That's not our war. And then as AQAP started holding cities and started risking Aden, which is a pretty strategically important port, then all of a sudden all of those firm principles went out the window, and Brennan was saying and Obama was saying, oh, well, we've got to use signature strikes, and we've got to roll it out in such a way that we can hit insurgents who are fighting the Yemeni dictatorship rather than people who might be targeting the United States. So in other words, what we're seeing, Scott, is really a big campaign on the part of John Brennan and the White House to kind of distract us away from the fact that we're going to war against Yemen, against people who aren't really a threat to the United States.
Right. Going to war in Yemen on behalf of the dictatorship of Yemen that Hillary Clinton calls a democracy because they held a Saddam Hussein-style one-man election a month or two ago.
And Saudi Arabia. I mean, this is also Saudi Arabia's interest, not just Yemen. But, yeah. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about this is they're portraying what has happened in the last year is, oh my gosh, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula turned out to be a lot stronger militarily than we thought. There's no confession, there's no admission on the part of the administration, instead, that, oh my gosh, President Saleh was two-timing us, basically, was using all of the money we gave him to protect him, to fight terrorism, and instead using it to protect himself and shore up his power. And now you've got the military in Yemen basically on strike against their own government.
Well, and in the Times piece, they make such a big deal of invoking Abdulmutallab and saying that, well, that was really a wake-up call. Imagine if that plane had really exploded, everybody, that kind of thing. Yeah, but they don't acknowledge that was on Christmas. But if they just rewind 3 and 4 and 5 weeks, they could just go back to the history on antiwar.com and read about how America was pretending to be Yemen and was bombing them starting in November. And so, right. Then they say, oh my God, they dared to retaliate for that. Maybe we really do have a problem there. When it was so obvious they'd started the whole, intervention and blowback all took place within 3-4 weeks.
Well, the other thing is that, there are really subtle places in the New York Times article where I've argued that it's somebody, and I suspect it's Brennan, actually giving a quote on deep background. So in other words, it's a direct quote from somebody in the administration, but it's not in quotation marks and it's not attributed. Mm-hmm. And I say that because if that's not true, then the New York Times was making completely unjustified judgments, saying that the drone is a precision weapon that reflects Obama's values,
right.
saying that drones have eviscerated Al-Qaeda. And then, most interestingly, they said that the Al-Mujalla strike, which is the worst strike in Yemen, it was a strike on December 17th, 2009, that killed 40-some women and children. Basically what happened is it killed some people who allegedly were AQAP fighters, but it also killed this Bedouin tribe that was there. Killed, a good part of the Bedouin tribe. They used cluster bombs, so it made things worse. Terrible,
Amnesty International did a whole write-up on this one.
Right. What's interesting is the New York Times article says, well, we hit our target. We hit our target, but we killed a bunch of other civilians. Never mind that they've been lying for 3 years and saying we didn't kill the civilians, but we killed our target. What I find really interesting about that is in the very days after that strike, ABC had a story that said the target was people planning an imminent attack against the United States. That was December 17th, 2009. We had advanced knowledge of the Abdulmutallab strike. We didn't know the real details, but we had, in addition to wiretaps mentioning it, we'd heard discussion that a Nigerian was planning an attack.
Mm-hmm.
We had advanced. So I wonder to this day whether we struck a Bedouin tribe in Al-Mujalla, causing, which is really the source of where a lot of our problems in Yemen go, thinking we were going to hit Abdulmutallab. And instead, he was already halfway to the United States.
Yeah. Well, I think the original strikes have started in November, so my theory still holds. Just not on that particular strike.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with
you.
But,
I think remember now, Richard Wolff, who is sort of, kept little MSNBC boy kind of guy for the White House and very close to the chief of staff, that kind of guy. He went on MSNBC and said, and I'm not saying necessarily he was right on this or whatever, but he said that Obama apparently was paranoid that the intelligence agencies had set him up and had let this guy through. And a terrible thing had almost happened, which was, for the White House, and maybe not necessarily the president himself, but for the White House to arrange for this guy, Richard Wolff, to go and say that on MSNBC, I thought was a pretty big deal.
Well, and remember, it wouldn't even necessarily have to be our intelligence agencies. We are dependent upon the Saudis' intelligence for human intelligence in Yemen. We also know, because WikiLeaks leaked it, Julian Assange is going to be shipped back to Sweden and soon be on his way to the United States for teaching us this. But we know that in August or September of that year, Saleh was probably going, well, you can do whatever you want in my country, but if you get hit, then it's not my fault. And then guess what? We got hit. Our partners in that part of the world really aren't trustworthy, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if I were Obama and I had those concerns.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, here we have John Glazer at antiwar.com writing, Yemen continues military offensive in south, aided by U.S. troops and bombs. And hundreds have been killed in recent weeks with very little information on their identities. And this is, as Jeremy Scahill wrote in The Nation, too, in America's Yemen Policy Backfire, something like that, it was all about how all of our anti-terrorism effort in Yemen has simply gone to fight the regime's enemies, who are legion, right, who don't necessarily have to have any, and are actually many different legions who don't necessarily have any ties to each other, right?
Yeah. And that's the thing. The administration is not admitting that, clearly with Saleh, he was double dealing us. Clearly with Saleh, he was taking all this money, using it to enrich his family, using it to develop his own personal guard, doing nothing for the country. And it would probably go a long way if we had admitted that.
This Post piece says, in Yemen, U.S. airstrikes breed anger and sympathy for Al-Qaeda. Wow, that's really something to have in the Washington Post. Ask them about the motivation for September 11th and see what they say. But then I'm sure you must have saw or read about Leon Panetta on Sunday morning on ABC was asked, hey, is it possible that our policy in Yemen is actually just creating more enemies every time we drop a bomb over there? And Panetta kind of flipped out and didn't really answer the question. He just said, look, there are bad guys. We have these tools. We have to use them. And he didn't really address, but I guess he was implying that yeah, we recognize that we create more enemies every time we do it, but we just can't stop. Once you're in a hole, you got to grab a shovel and keep digging. That's what Hillary Clinton says. That's the policy.
Yeah, and actually, there's a great quote from Dennis Blair in the New York Times piece, and I'm going to misquote him because I don't have it right in front of me. But he basically says the problem with the administration is they don't have a strategy. They have the drone strike, and they are saying literally, this is the only game in town, so get on board. And so we don't know how we're using the drone strikes. We're just using them because we haven't taken a step back and said, how are we going to keep the country safe? And how are we, frankly, going to, eliminate these failed states, largely failed because of Yemen is still recovering from Cold War politics, much less neoliberalism, right. Much less the oil curse, much less everything else. So how do you solve a problem like Yemen? Because there are lots of people in Yemen who really do deserve peace and some kind of stability in their lives, and we're not doing anything for them. We're making it worse.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and it's just like in Andrew Bacevich's recent piece at Tom Dispatch and antiwar.com, where he's talking about, the tool you use helps determine the policy in a lot of ways, and when it's really easy to use the special forces all the time and keep it all secret, even from the Congress and everybody else. And when it's really easy to fly remote control planes around, killing people, why, you could spread a war all the way across the world, man. You could fight every militia in Africa if you wanted to. If it just comes down to remote control planes and special forces teams, you could go to war anywhere and everywhere forever. Now, any armed group that opposes any state that you pick the side of, we can have an intervention, call it a war on terrorism, and it's way past out of control now, and it's all secret, no accountability, and so no way to really even measure all the consequences, since so much of it is made secret. But certainly there are consequences, and there will be more.
Yeah, and I think that Dennis Blair quote is really important, because if we were basically going to war, we also have F-15s that we're using in Yemen now. We're going to war in Yemen, and we don't have a strategy. We haven't figured out a way to fix what makes Yemen so dangerous to us to a small degree, but to the Saudis clearly to a large degree, and for better or worse, we're dependent on them they're our drug dealers, right? And we don't have any solutions to that, so instead we're just going to keep launching drones.
Well, and it'll work out, I'm sure, because waging war on the Arabian Peninsula, or actually even from the Arabian Peninsula, has always worked out so well for us in the past. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. As always, you're brilliant, Marcy. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Take care.
All right, everybody. That's Marcy Wheeler, emptywheel.net. That's where you find her great blog. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We're done for today. See you tomorrow.